I turned 60 the same way I turned every year before it, quietly, modestly, without fanfare. The morning began with the sound of my old coffee maker sputtering to life and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. My wife Helen had left a card on the table. No envelope, no bow. Just a folded piece of paper that said, "Happy 60th, Harold. Don't wait up tonight." I thought it was one of her dry jokes. She had grown fond of those in the past few years. The kind that sounded harmless, until you realized there was nothing playful behind them. The cake she'd ordered for me 2 days earlier still sat untouched on the counter, the words "Happy 60th" written in bright blue icing that already looked tired. I stared at it for a long time before blowing out the candles myself, alone, just to see if they'd go out in one breath. They did. Helen had been restless for months. I noticed it in the way she avoided my eyes when we sat down for dinner, or how her laughter faded halfway through whenever we watched those old comedies she used to love. There were missed calls I wasn't supposed to ask about, perfume that lingered even when she swore she hadn't gone anywhere. I pretended not to see. Pretending is something men like me get good at when they've built a life that feels too fragile to shake. I kept telling myself she'd settle down once we took that road trip we'd always planned. Once I finally retired. Once we had the time to remember who we were before bills and obligations turned everything grey. But that day never came. It was just past 8 p.m. when she came into the kitchen holding her suitcase. She didn't even try to hide it this time. The zipper was open, the clothes neatly folded inside, no panic, no second thoughts. "You don't need to see me off," she said flatly. "I'll be gone by the time the cab gets here." My voice cracked when I asked where she was going. "Somewhere warmer," she replied. Then she looked at me, really looked, and said something I'll never forget. "You've become small, Harold. Everything about this life feels smaller with you in it. It's strange, the details that stay in your mind during moments like that." I remember the sound of the wall clock ticking behind her, the faint drip of the faucet, the smell of the lemon cleaner I'd used earlier that morning. I wanted to say something to stop her, something dignified or brave, but all that came out was a whisper. "After 40 years." She didn't answer. She just closed the suitcase and waited by the door, staring at her phone until the headlights from the cab swept across the living room curtains. When she left, she didn't close the door all the way. It swung shut on its own a few seconds later, that soft click echoing louder than any slam could have. I sat there for hours after she left, not moving, not thinking, just existing. The air in the house felt heavier, like every piece of furniture was mourning too. Her empty coffee mug still sat on the table, lipstick smudge and all. The silence was unbearable, so I turned on the old radio. AM static and faint jazz from a station somewhere downstate. The song was one Helen loved, back when we still danced in the kitchen after dinner. I shut it off. Some memories hurt too much to play again. By midnight, the neighbors' lights had all gone out. I poured myself a drink and stood by the window, staring at the street we'd lived on for nearly 3 decades. I could still see the faint tire tracks where her cab had stopped. It was funny, in a cruel way, how something as small as tire marks could feel like a scar. I thought of calling my daughter, but she and Helen had grown close over the years, and I wasn't ready for the quiet judgment in her voice. "Dad, what did you do this time?" I could already hear it. Instead, I cleaned. Not out of purpose, but instinct. I wiped the counters, folded the laundry, even straightened the cushions on the couch like a man trying to reassemble a version of life that didn't exist anymore. When I finally sat back down, the clock read 2:14 a.m. That's when the phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Langley, this is Robert Clark. I'm an attorney in Boston. I'm calling about your brother. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. My brother, Robert Langley, had been dead to me for 30 years, long before his heart ever stopped beating. We hadn't spoken since our father's funeral, not since the company he inherited from Dad collapsed and took half of my savings with it." "What about him?" I asked cautiously. The lawyer hesitated. "I'm afraid to say your brother passed last week, but before he did, he left specific instructions regarding you. He wanted you notified immediately." I felt my stomach tighten. "Notified of what?" "That's better discussed in person, sir. If you're able, I'd like to meet tomorrow morning to go over the details of your late brother's will." I wanted to hang up, to tell him I wasn't interested in anything that man had left behind. But something in his tone stopped me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of a man with nothing left to lose. "All right," I said. "What time?" 10 a.m. sharp. "And Mr. Langley, bring identification." When the call ended, I sat there staring at the dark reflection of myself in the window. The words "your brother's will" echoed louder than Helen's last goodbye. I had no idea then that both sentences, hers and his, would rewrite my life completely. Before I finally went to bed that night, I whispered something into the still air. Not a prayer, not exactly. Just a plea to whatever was listening. If there's a reason for all this, please let it show itself. It did. But not in any way I could have imagined. The morning after Helen left felt like waking up inside someone else's life. The bed was cold on one side, and the air smelled faintly of her perfume mixed with lemon cleaner. I brewed my coffee, but it didn't taste like anything. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older than 60. Older than my father ever did at 70. I'd slept maybe 2 hours, my mind replaying that call from the lawyer over and over. Your brother's will. The words sat in my head like an echo that refused to fade. By 9:30 I had showered, shaved, and put on my best jacket, the one Helen always said made me look like a retired detective. It was wrinkled, but I didn't care. I drove to the address the lawyer had given me, a tall brick building downtown, its brass directory letters dulled by years of fingerprints. The plaque beside the entrance read, "Clark and Associates, estate law since 1963. The kind of firm that smelled of old money and older secrets." The elevator creaked as it climbed, each floor humming like a pulse in my ears. When the doors opened on the 7th floor, I stepped into a narrow hallway lined with framed photos, men in suits shaking hands, ceremonial ribbon cuttings, plaques with names I didn't recognize. A secretary with perfect posture looked up from behind her desk and offered a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Langley, Mr. Clark will see you now." The office was dim but elegant, the blinds half drawn to let in the grey light of a winter morning. Robert Clark stood by a mahogany desk, a man in his late 50s with sharp features and a voice that carried authority without needing volume. He gestured for me to sit. "Mr. Langley, thank you for coming on such short notice." "I didn't have much else planned," I said, and immediately regretted how bitter it sounded. He gave a polite nod, as though he understood more than I'd said. "Your brother, Robert Langley, appointed me as executor of his estate. Before I begin, I want to express my condolences. He passed quietly in his sleep 2 weeks ago." I nodded stiffly. I didn't know how to mourn a man I'd stopped speaking to 3 decades ago. "Oh, we weren't close." "Yes, I gathered that," Clark replied, flipping open a thick folder. Still, he was quite specific in his final instructions. He left letters for each of his immediate relatives. "For you, there's something more tangible." He paused, sliding a small sealed envelope across the table. My name was written in my brother's handwriting, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. Seeing it hit me harder than I expected. For years I'd tried to forget that slanted loop on the H, the way he always dotted his I halfway between words. 1,000 memories crowded in. The two of us working in our father's hardware store, arguing about college loans, sharing cigars on the porch the night before his wedding. Before everything went wrong, I didn't open it. "Not yet." "What's in there?" "I'm afraid I don't know," Clark said. "But I can tell you that the rest of your brother's estate has already been distributed. His investments, his company shares, his property, all have been claimed by other parties. However," he leaned back slightly as if studying me, "there's one asset no one seems to understand. A storage unit in Bay Harbor registered under your name." "Under my name?" I repeated. "That doesn't make sense." "I've never been to Bay Harbor," Clark nodded. "It appears he transferred ownership years ago, perhaps as a contingency." The key was among his personal effects. He reached into the folder again and produced a small brass key attached to a tag that read Doc 17. The metal felt cold in my palm, heavier than it looked. "What's there?" "That, Mr. Langley, is what we don't know. The rental agreement was renewed automatically every year. Paid in full, always on time. No inventory list, no declared contents. My office is authorized to release the location to you effective immediately." I stared at the key, trying to reconcile the absurdity of it. My brother, the man who once told me I'd never understand business, had left me a mystery on a dock somewhere. Maybe it was junk, Or maybe it was one last way to mock me. "Why would he do this?" I asked. Clark's expression softened. "Sometimes guilt writes its own language, Mr. Langley. People express remorse in strange ways." I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket. "Is that all?" "One last thing." He pulled a thin sheet of paper from the file, a signed copy of the will. He wanted this read to you personally. A single line, for Harold, who stayed when everyone else left. For the first time in years, my throat tightened. My brother, the same man who'd cut me out of our father's company, who'd vanished without a trace, had remembered that one truth. I was the one who stayed. Through the bankruptcy, through our mother's illness, through everything. Maybe that's what haunted him. Outside, the winter air felt sharper, as if the city itself had turned to glass. So I stood on the sidewalk for a while, watching traffic pass, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Helen's betrayal and Robert's letter tangled in my mind, until they felt like two halves of the same cruel coin. One person leaves you to feel small, another reaches from the grave to make you feel seen. By the time I got home, the afternoon light was fading. The house was silent again, but this time the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt waiting. I poured myself a coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten on old stationery. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear. "Harold, if you're reading this, it means I didn't find the courage to say these things in life. I was wrong about many things, about money, about pride, and most of all about you. There are things you deserve to know, and they're all at Doc 17. I couldn't give you the apology you deserved while I was alive, but maybe what's there will explain why I disappeared. Don't hate me for what you find. I did it all for family, even when I forgot what that meant. Your brother, Robert." The paper trembled in my hands, but not from cold. I read it twice, then a third time, tracing every loop and curve of his handwriting. Dock 17, Bay Harbor. The name echoed like a heartbeat. For the first time since Helen walked out, I felt something other than loss, something closer to purpose. The key glinted faintly in the fading light on the table, as though it had been waiting all these years just to be touched. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, listening to the tick of the wall clock Helen had once insisted was too loud. At dawn, I packed a small bag, just a thermos, a notepad, and my father's old pocket knife. The drive from my town to Bay Harbor would take about 4 hours. I had nothing else left to lose, and for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't terrify me. It freed me. Before leaving, I stood in the doorway of my house and looked back one last time. Every corner carried her absence now. The missing shoes by the door, the empty hook where her coat used to hang, the faint dent in the couch where she always sat reading. I didn't know if I'd ever come back. Maybe I didn't want to. As the car engine rumbled to life, I whispered into the morning cold, "All right, Robert. Let's see what you left behind." The road stretched ahead, endless and quiet. Somewhere between the fog and the first light, I realized this wasn't just about a will. It was about two brothers, both ghosts in their own ways, still trying to speak to each other across the years. And as I drove toward the docks, I finally allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would give me back the pieces of myself I'd been missing all along. Bay Harbor was one of those coastal towns that looked postcard perfect from afar, but felt hollow when you got close. The air smelled of salt, oil, and old wood. Like every dream that had been built here eventually sank. The drive had been long, but I didn't feel tired. The letter had kept me awake inside my own head the entire way. Every word of it carried my brother's voice, measured, proud, haunted. Dock 17. I repeated it under my breath as I passed a row of rusted boats. Some tilted to one side, abandoned. Others looked freshly painted, ready for another run at survival. I parked beside a small grey office labelled Bay Harbor Storage and Marine Services and stepped out into the chill. The ocean wind bit through my jacket, but I barely noticed. The key in my pocket had begun to feel like a live wire. Inside, a balding man sat behind a counter cluttered with paperwork and coffee rings. He looked up from his newspaper when I entered. "Can I help you, sir?" "Yeah," I said, sliding the brass key across the counter. Dock 17, Robert Langley. He adjusted his glasses, took the key, and typed something into an ancient computer. "Robert Langley. His voice dropped a little. "Hasn't been opened in over 15 years. All paid in full, though. Must have meant something." "It did," I murmured. He handed the key back. "Straight down past the fueling station, last dock before the pier ends. You'll see a grey boathouse. Lock should fit the lower hatch." I thanked him and headed out. The wind whipped stronger now, scattering gull cries across the water. As I walked down the weathered boards, I could almost hear my brother's voice from decades ago teasing me. "You always overthink everything, Harold. Just open the damn box." The boathouse stood alone at the far end of the dock, its paint peeling like a snake's old skin. The lock clicked open with a single twist, smoother than I expected. I pushed the door and it creaked like a confession. Inside was dim and smelled of seawater and metal. A single shaft of light cut through a broken window, landing directly on a large wooden chest in the corner, navy blue with brass hinges dulled by age. My pulse kicked hard. Every story I'd ever heard about hidden fortunes or buried guilt suddenly felt uncomfortably real. I knelt beside the chest. The latch gave with little resistance. The lid rose slowly, dust spiraling into the light. Inside lay a collection of items so ordinary they almost felt mocking. A leather-bound notebook, several manila folders tied with string, and a stack of envelopes sealed with wax. Beneath them, wrapped carefully in a cloth, was an old photograph of two boys, me and Robert, standing beside our father's first store. The edges were curled, but the moment was intact. Robert grinning like he owned the world, me squinting into the sun, trying to keep up. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was as if the years between that photo and this moment had collapsed into one long mistake. I picked up the notebook first. Its cover was cracked, the leather worn smooth from handling. Inside were pages of our father's handwriting mixed with Robert's. Ledger notes, sketches of inventory, loan amounts, calculations. But halfway through, the handwriting shifted. New entries appeared in Robert's firm, modern script. June 14th, 1996. If Harold ever finds this, he'll understand why I did what I did. The company wasn't stolen. It was saved. Dad's debts would have destroyed us all. I took them on myself and signed my name to keep him out of prison. Harold never knew because I couldn't tell him. He'd never forgive me for the lies it required. My hands trembled. For 30 years I'd believed Robert betrayed me, took the business to feed his ego. But these words suggested something else, a sacrifice buried under misunderstanding. I turned the pages faster. December 3rd, 2001, the money is clean now. Whitestone Holdings is solvent, profitable. But I can't face him yet. Maybe someday. For until then, I'll make sure he's taken care of in ways he won't see. Below that, in smaller handwriting, one final entry. Dock 17 will be his someday. Let him decide what it means. I sat back against the wall, the wood cold against my spine. My brother hadn't vanished out of greed. He'd vanished out of guilt. Every piece of hatred I'd carried toward him felt suddenly misplaced, childish. I'd built my grief around a lie. I unwrapped the next bundle, those manila folders. Inside were property deeds, stock certificates and bank documents, all signed over to my name. The numbers were impossible. Shares, dividends, offshore accounts. Millions, maybe more. Each document bore a single annotation at the bottom, held in trust under Harold Langley. My breath caught. He'd been transferring assets quietly for years. My name had been attached to wealth I never knew existed. A new voice startled me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" I spun around. A man stood at the doorway, tall, silver-haired, holding a folder under his arm. For a second, I didn't recognize him. Then it clicked. It was Robert Clark, the lawyer. "How did you—" "I figured you'd come today," he said, stepping inside. "Your brother asked me to make sure you opened this yourself. No one else could explain it better than he could." He set the folder down next to the chest. Inside are letters for each member of the family. "Yours is on top." I opened the folder. The first envelope bore my name again, same slanted handwriting. I broke the seal with shaking fingers. "Harold, by now you've seen the documents. Everything I built after Father's death, every company, every investment, was meant to return what I took. The truth is, I never betrayed you. I protected you from the people who would have devoured you. When I disappeared, it wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. The government inquiries, the debts, the lawsuits, they would have dragged your name down with mine. I carried them alone so you could live in peace. I thought that was mercy. But silence becomes its own cruelty, doesn't it? You deserved the truth, and you deserved more than an apology. Everything here belongs to you. But money won't fix the years we lost. If there's one thing I learned building empires, it's that they crumble without love. Don't let it make you hard, Harold. Let it make you free, Robert. When I finished reading, I just sat there in the quiet. The ocean outside groaned against the docks like it, too, had been waiting for this moment. Clark remained silent, giving me the kind of space only an old lawyer knows how to give. I finally asked, "Does anyone else know about this?" He shook his head. "Only me. Robert wanted it that way. The others, his partners, his heirs, they think the accounts were dissolved." "Why me?" I whispered. "Because you stayed." Clark smiled faintly, echoing the line from the will. He told me once that staying takes more courage than running 100 companies. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I signed acknowledgement papers, verified identities, and locked the chest again. Clark promised the legal transitions would take time, but assured me the accounts were legitimate. The numbers still didn't feel real. Millions. My brother's way of saying I'm sorry. As I stood on the dock one last time, the sky burned orange over the water. The wind had calmed and the gulls circled quietly. I thought of Helen, how she said I'd become small. She was wrong. I hadn't become small. I'd just been waiting for the right moment to see how big my story truly was. And now, because of a man I thought I hated, I was a millionaire overnight. Still, it wasn't the money that made me tremble. It was the line in Robert's letter that refused to leave my head. Silence becomes its own cruelty. For the first time in my life, I wondered if forgiveness could speak louder than grief. I closed the boathouse door behind me, locked it, and whispered, "Thank you." "Robert?" The wind carried it away across the darkening sea, as if somewhere out there. My brother might finally have heard me. I barely slept that night. My mind was too full, too loud. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's handwriting, heard his voice on that crackling cassette, and felt the cool brass of Dad's old watch pressing against my palm. By dawn, I'd made coffee twice and forgotten to drink it both times. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt alive, whispering reminders of everything I'd just learned. I wasn't just the forgotten brother anymore. I was the keeper of a legacy that had been buried under decades of misunderstanding. When the first sunlight cut across the kitchen floor, I finally sat down and opened the folder again. The documents felt heavier now, as if they knew what they carried. I spent hours reading through every page, tracing the path of every transaction my brother had ever made. The deeper I went, the more I saw how carefully he'd built this web of protection around me. Each company, each investment, each property had been structured to pass quietly into my name through a chain of trusts and holding accounts. He had designed it all like an architect of redemption. Robert had never been running from wealth. He'd been running toward forgiveness. But forgiveness isn't something you can inherit. You have to face it. That realization hit me like a wave. I couldn't just accept the money and move on. I needed to understand why my brother had gone to such extremes, what he had done, who he had become in those missing decades. So I called Clark. He answered after only one ring, his tone already knowing. "You found the second trunk?" "Yes," I said. "And I found the tape," a pause. "Then you know most of it already." "Not enough," I replied. "I need the rest." The parts he didn't write down. The lawyer sighed softly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. "Come to my office this afternoon. There are files that were sealed until you confirmed your identity. I think you're ready for them now." I arrived at Clark & Associates just after noon. The winter sun barely warmed the streets, and the city's noise seemed to fade as I walked through those tall brass doors again. Clark greeted me in his office with that same measured calm. He had a stack of folders already on his desk, bound with red ribbons. "Your brother planned every step," he said. "Even this conversation." He handed me the first folder. "This," he said, "is the story behind Whitestone Holdings." The documents were detailed records, contracts, receipts, letters between lawyers, even handwritten notes from board meetings. I read each one and the picture began to form. Robert had rebuilt Whitestone from ashes. After our father's debts destroyed the original business, Robert had gone underground, metaphorically and literally. He created shell companies to buy back the assets under different names, cleaned their finances, and slowly merged them into a single legitimate enterprise. For 20 years he worked in silence, turning every ounce of shame into steel. One memo caught my eye, Internal Review 2015. It detailed an investigation into Whitestone's operations by federal auditors. Apparently, Robert had cooperated fully and had even turned over all records voluntarily. The conclusion read, "No criminal activity found. Company cleared. Outstanding management integrity noted. He had redeemed not just the company but our family name. Why didn't he tell me any of this?" I asked. Clark leaned back in his chair. "Pride," he said simply. "And fear. He thought you'd never forgive him for the first betrayal. The only way he knew how to apologize was through action. So he built an empire and handed it back to you." I shook my head slowly. "He didn't just hand it back. He turned his life into an apology." Clark smiled faintly. "Yes, but there's more. Your brother wasn't just protecting you from financial ruin. He was protecting you from a person. That made me sit up." "Who?" He opened the next folder. Inside were photographs, grainy black and white, taken from security cameras. A woman, early 50s, smartly dressed, standing beside Robert in what looked like a boardroom. "Her name was Evelyn Monroe," Clark said. "She was your brother's former business partner and your ex-wife's financial advisor." My stomach dropped. "Helen?" He nodded. "Yes, I'm afraid she knew more than she let on. Evelyn and your wife were involved in a series of speculative investments a few years ago. When Whitestone started gaining traction, they tried to leverage the company's private holdings through offshore accounts, using your name. Robert found out and shut it down immediately. Evelyn threatened him, and Helen walked away from the marriage shortly after that." The room tilted slightly. I gripped the armrest of the chair to steady myself. "So when Helen left, she already knew?" "She thought your brother was hiding something," Clark said. "And she was right. But she didn't realize he was hiding it to protect you." For a long moment I couldn't speak. Betrayal has a strange way of repeating itself through generations. I'd lost faith in my brother because of money, and Helen had lost faith in me for the same reason. None of us had trusted the truth. "What happened to Evelyn?" I asked quietly. "She passed away 3 years ago," Clark said. "Liver cancer. She made a full confession in her final statement, which your brother kept sealed until now." He handed me another envelope. I opened it and read the first line. "Robert, tell Harold I'm sorry. I thought I was saving him from you. I didn't realize you were the one saving him from me." I closed it slowly. The weight of it all pressed down so hard that I had to remind myself to breathe. "I don't know what to do with all this," I said finally. "The money, the company. It feels poisoned." Clark shook his head. "No, Mr. Langley, it's not poisoned. It's purified. Your brother spent half his life cleaning it. The only thing left to do now is decide what you want it to mean." That night I went back to the docks again. I sat in the boathouse for hours, the chest open beside me, Robert's tape replaying softly in the background. I watched the tide roll in, the moon glinting on the water like silver coins scattered across black velvet. I thought about everything, the lies, the sacrifices, the years of silence. My brother's life had been a monument to quiet penance. Mine had been a monument to misunderstanding. And now somehow the two had fused into something like peace. But one question still burned in me. Why the timing? Why now after all these years? Why on my 60th birthday? It couldn't be coincidence. I opened the notebook again and flipped to the final page. There, scrawled in faint ink, was a date. December 18th, 2022, the day Helen left me. Below it, a single line. If he's reading this, he'll understand the timing. My hands trembled. My brother had known. He'd timed the release of the will, the letter, and the entire inheritance to reach me exactly when I lost everything else. He'd planned for me to break so I could rebuild. It was almost cruel in its perfection. The next morning I drove to the cemetery where our parents were buried. I brought the watch, the letter, and the cassette tape. The ground was covered in frost, the headstones gleaming pale in the cold sun. Robert's grave was next to theirs, simple and unadorned, except for a single brass plaque that read, "Robert Langley, 1958-2023. He kept his word. I knelt down and placed the watch at the base of the stone. "I did, Robert," I whispered. "You kept it better than anyone." The wind rustled through the bare trees, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. I could almost hear his laugh again, the same one from the photo in the trunk, carefree and young. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. After a long while I stood and looked out at the horizon. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a question waiting to be answered. I knew then what I had to do. When I got home, I called Clark. "I'm not keeping the company," I told him. "Not all of it, anyway. I want to restructure Whitestone as a charitable trust. Half the assets go towards small business recovery programs. The rest set up scholarships in Dad's name, and I want Robert's name on every plaque." Clark was silent for a moment. Then he said softly, "That's exactly what he hoped you'd do." The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, signatures, and headlines. The media caught wind of the story. "Reclusive businessman leaves fortune to brother he betrayed." It spread fast, and for once I didn't hide from it. People sent letters, some offering congratulations, others sharing stories of brothers they'd lost or wronged. I read every one of them. Some made me cry, some made me laugh. All of them reminded me that grief, when shared, becomes lighter. On the day the Whitestone Foundation officially launched, I stood before the small crowd of reporters and spoke into the microphones with a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. My brother and I spent most of our lives misunderstanding each other. He built walls out of guilt. I built them out of resentment. But he tore his down before the end, and I owe it to him to do the same. This company began as our father's dream, fell as our failure, and rose again as my brother's redemption. Now it belongs to everyone who's ever needed a second chance. There was applause, polite at first, then genuine. Somewhere in that sound, I imagined Robert's voice again, proud, amused, saying, "About time you spoke up, little brother." That night, back home, I poured a glass of whiskey and sat by the window. The lights from the city shimmered in the distance, reflections dancing on the glass like quiet ghosts. On the table beside me lay the watch, ticking again after I'd had it repaired. Every tick was a reminder. Time doesn't heal everything, but it reveals what matters most. I thought about Helen. I hadn't heard from her since she left, and I didn't expect to. But if she ever saw my name in the papers, I hoped she'd understand that her leaving wasn't the end of me. It was the catalyst for everything that came after. The house no longer felt haunted. It felt lived in. And when I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, I didn't feel alone. I felt surrounded. By memory, by forgiveness, by the strange grace that comes from surviving yourself. That was the truth behind the will. It wasn't about money. It was about mercy. My brother hadn't just left me wealth. He'd left me a chance to be the kind of man he always believed I could be. And for the first time in my 60 years, I finally believed it too. 5 years is enough time to change the shape of a life without changing its soul. In the 5 years after the foundation opened its doors, I learned that dignity has a sound. It is the quiet of a baker unlocking her shop again at 4 a.m. The soft click of a library's lights returning after a city budget cut. The low murmur of a night shift nurse who didn't have to sell her car. When reporters asked me for numbers, I gave them names. When they asked for impact, I gave them stories. And when they asked for a hero, I gave them my brother. On the first anniversary of the foundation, we held a small gathering in a renovated warehouse. Exposed brick, 100 folding chairs, a thrift store piano that a local music teacher had tuned for free. I wore the same jacket Helen had once said made me look like a retired detective. It fit me different now. Looser in the shoulders, easier near the heart. Clark sat in the front row, hands folded on his cane, a smile caught halfway between pride and relief. We didn't do a ribbon cutting or a photo op. We did what my father used to call a roll call of gratitude. People stood and said their names and told the room what had been returned to them. A lease, a license, a lungful of hope they'd thought was already spent. When it was my turn, I didn't take the stage. I stayed where I was and said, "My name is Harold, and I have learned that the only thing wealth is good for is washing the names of the dead." Someone in the back, older, worn thin, a mechanic by the look of his hands, raised 2 fingers like a shy salute. "Then your brother's name is clean, sir," he said. I had to sit down after that. The room wouldn't stop swaying. I kept returning to Dock 17, not out of superstition but out of discipline. Grief needs practice the way forgiveness does. The boathouse took the seasons like an old violin takes rosin. It accepted what made it sing. In summer, children leapt from the pier and the water slapped the pylons like applause. In winter, the fog closed around the harbour until the whole town sounded like a held breath. I learned which boards complained and which ones sang. I learned the scent of the tide at first light. I learned what it meant to speak to someone you loved without expecting an answer. I learned to answer anyway. Year 2, the Foundation's first scholarship recipient wrote to me from a dorm room 2 states away. "I'm studying accounting because my father couldn't," the letter began. Her name was Elise. Her mother had run a corner store that folded when the landlord doubled the rent. She signed off with a postscript I read 3 times, P.S. I keep a little clock on my desk that ticks too loud. I used to hate it. Now it makes me feel like somebody's awake with me. I sent her dad's watch for the semester and asked for it back at graduation. When she returned it with a tassel tied to the band, I wound it and said aloud in my kitchen, "Still awake, Dad." I grew older the way some houses do, sounder in the frame, softer in the light. My hair went all the way white around the ears, and the lines under my eyes learned to hold both tears and laughter without collapsing. Sometimes, if I caught my reflection unexpectedly, I saw my brother standing behind me like a patient correction. "That'll do," his face seemed to say. "Keep going." 3 winters in, I received a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was an old key with a red thread tied near the bow, and a note written in a tight, careful script. "For Doc 17, thank you for leaving certain doors unlatched." There was no signature, only a smudge of oil at the corner like a thumbprint. I carried the key around for weeks before I understood what to do with it. I hung it on a nail inside the boathouse, where sunlight sometimes fell like a blessing. It did not open anything I could find. It opened something in me. By the 4th year, Clark called less for signatures and more for lunch. We'd meet at a diner near the courthouse, where the coffee tasted like it had been faithful to the same pot for 40 years. He ordered meatloaf and told me stories about cases that had ended well and lawyers who hadn't. Once, between bites, he said, "You know, your brother had 10 different ways of saying no and only one way of saying yes. But his yes, that man kept it. I asked him what my yes looked like. Clark dabbed the corner of his mouth with a napkin and said, like someone finally stopped arguing with reality. On the way out, he slipped a small envelope into my coat pocket. Inside was a photograph. 2 young men standing in front of a hardware store, one grinning like the door had already opened, the other squinting like the sun was a question. On the back, Clark had written, "They both arrived." The 5th year brought an invitation I could not have imagined on the night Helen left. The city asked me to give the keynote at the Whitestone Centennial, the quiet rebranding of a history the town had once tried to forget. I declined twice and accepted the 3rd time. It was held in the refurbished Opera House, velvet seats and a chandelier that made the light taste like honey. The mayor introduced me as a man who had turned inheritance into instrument, and I stood at a podium that had outlived a century of speeches and lies. I took Dad's watch from my pocket, set it on the wood where I could hear it if I leaned close, and began. "I don't know how to make speeches," I said. "I only know how to keep promises. My father promised that work mattered because people mattered. My brother promised he would fix what he broke. He did both. I'm here to keep their rhythm." I told them about the bakery in Kansas and the library lights and the nurse's car and Elise's ticking clock. I told them the foundation would not put its name on marble, but on receipts paid in full. I told them that justice had 2 hands and one of them was mercy. When I finished, there was that kind of applause that starts in the soles of feet and works its way up until a room sounds like it has remembered its own spine. Afterward, backstage, a woman approached me with the caution of someone who expects to be turned away. She was in her 70s, hair silvered at the temples, posture both proud and apologetic. She extended a hand that shook only a little. "I'm Margaret," she said. "I worked for your father at the first store. I also dated your brother before he married. We fought. He said things. I said worse. I kept a ledger you should have." From her bag she produced a notebook no larger than my palm. Inside were names and hours and pay envelopes carefully assigned with notes like "Advance sick mother" and "Extra for winter coat." At the back a page titled "Debts I owe Harold," and beneath it not money but words. I wrongly believed silence was kindness. It is not, it is lazy. There was no signature, but I would have known that handwriting even without the ache that rose in my chest. I pressed the little ledger to my ribs, as if the paper needed reminding where hearts live. "Thank you," I said to Margaret, "for keeping the books." She laughed once, quick and old. We women always do. Not all letters were kind. Some accused the foundation of buying absolution. Some asked why it took a fortune to do what decency could do for free. A younger version of me would have hunched under those words, or tried to fight them, until I broke into the smallest pieces possible. The man I had become read them twice, answered when there was a question, and filed them when there was only heat. The only absolution I needed, I wrote once, was to look at my brother's name without flinching. I mailed the letter and slept well in private. I did the ordinary holy things, learned how to make an omelette without breaking the surface, oiled the hinges of the front door, changed light bulbs before they popped, called my daughter on Sundays, and did not say anything about the years she favored her mother over me. I asked about the garden she was coaxing from terrible soil. I listened when she told me about a neighbor who kept parking in her spot as if lines were decorative. One afternoon, after describing a tomato that had survived a late frost, she paused and said, "Dad, I saw the interview. I'm sorry I didn't ask earlier about Uncle Robert. I told her there was nothing to be sorry for." She said that wasn't true. We were both wrong. We were both right. We both laughed. It sounded like people who might take a walk together soon. Sometimes I wondered about Helen. The mind does not leave quietly what the heart learned loudly. She wrote once more, a shorter letter this time. "I hope Florida forgives me before you do. If you ever come this way, there is a bench near the water where old pelicans argue like married couples. I sit there and let them win. If you sit there someday, leave room for someone who failed at ordinary happiness." I folded the page, held it to my cheek, and sent her a photograph of Elise's graduation with no note. People learn from what we do not say. The foundation took on a case that, without meaning to, brought us full circle. A coastal town petitioned for emergency funds after a storm swallowed half their pier. Their letterhead read Bay Harbor City Council. The photographs showed pilings chewed to splinters, a long wound where the dock once told boats how to come home. The councilwoman's note was short. "We have fishermen sleeping in their trucks. The pier was their address and their schedule. Help us rebuild the clock." We did not send a check. We drove there with lumber and gloves and an engineer who had built bridges in 3 languages. I hammered until my shoulders sang. Clark supervised like a conductor who used to play tuba. Teenagers from the high school carried planks on their shoulders as if they were promises. The day we set the last board, the tide answered with a soft slap like gratitude. A boy jumped in fully clothed and came up laughing like a bell. I leaned on the railing and whispered, "Robert, look, your house is fixed." That evening, when the workers had gone and the harbor settled into its blue quiet, I walked alone to the end of the new pier. The boathouse still stood where it had, paint now repaired by a volunteer who said peeling made him itch. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The chest waited with the kind of humility that knows it holds a universe. I did not open it. Some doors are meant to be honored by staying shut. Instead, I ran a finger along the brass plaque I had mounted beneath the lid years before. Built on mistakes, repaired by mercy. The words had darkened with salt, which made them truer. "All right," I said to the room, to the dock, to the tide, to the younger men we once had been. I kept my end. The room did what rooms do when they are trusted. It kept the sound safe and let me walk away without taking any of it back. When I turned, a figure stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the remainder of day. For an instant, my heart did the oldest trick of grief and thought, there he is. But it was Clark's grandson, Adam, the new associate at the firm. Hair a tumble of ideas and manners inherited from a man who ironed his socks. "Mr. Langley," he said, "the council is waiting by the ribbon." He grinned when he saw me looking at the uncut tape strung between 2 posts. "Old traditions, new wood," he said. "Want the honors?" We didn't use a ceremonial pair of scissors. We used my father's pocket knife. I handed it to the youngest kid on the crew and whispered, "Cut straight, but not too straight. Leave room for the pier to breathe." He nodded solemnly, sliced, and the ribbon fell into the water with a soft acceptance of its new career as a memory. People clapped and then kept standing there, no one wanting to leave first. The sky made a long, generous exit into night. On the drive home, I did something I had not done since my 20s. I took the long way on purpose. The road along the coast curled like an old dog settling in. I lowered the window and let the air make a liar of my years. At a turnout where the rock faced the open water, I pulled over and turned off the engine. The world rocked on its feet. The watch on my wrist, cleaned twice since Elise returned it, tick-tick-ticked like a bird stepping across snow. I spoke aloud with no embarrassment left in me to waste. "I think we did it right, Robert," I said. "Not perfect, right?" A wave climbed the shore and sighed down again. Agreement or gravity. Sometimes they are the same. The last winter before I turned 66, Clark called to say his doctor wanted him to stop arguing with stairs. We laughed like men who had shared more secrets than meals. "Come sit," he said. "I'll have tea and the good lemon cookies." In his apartment, books in true stacks, law journals that looked like they'd tutored the Constitution, we sat by a window that made the city behave like a painting. He slid an envelope across the table. "Don't worry," he said, seeing my face. "I'm not dying. Lawyers practice the exit years before the door. This is for the day I decide to be quiet for a living." Inside was the final clause my brother had written but never needed, a letter of resignation from the guilt that did not belong to me. It was written to no court, and every court signed in a hand I now knew could be both ruthless and tender. At the bottom, Clark had added a witness line of his own. I saw him write this without shaking. Spring returned like a choice. The foundation moved into a modest building with big windows and a stoop perfect for watching the weather think. On the wall by the door we mounted a simple list that changed each month, what we returned. It included nouns like dignity, afternoons, soprano lessons, and the honest ones too, like a second mortgage, a room to say no in. People read the list and added their own in pencil until the wall sounded like a choir. On the 5th anniversary of the Dock 17 rebuild, the town asked me to give one more speech. I agreed on the condition that speeches were replaced by stories. We held it at dusk. Children with salt-tangled hair sat cross-legged. Elders stood their years without complaint. Teenagers pretended not to listen and listened. I told them about a hardware store that made change in quarters and advice, about a brother who made amends in compound interest, about a woman in Florida who taught pelicans how to forgive. I told them about a ledger small enough to fit in a hand and large enough to balance a life. I ended with what I know now. There are no self-made men. There are only repaired ones. And if you're lucky, someone leaves you a key to the room where the repairs begin. Afterward, when the pier had given the day back to the night and the water had settled into its patient occupation of being water, I walked again to the boathouse. I stood at the threshold, hand on the frame, feeling how wood remembers every grip. "Good night," I said to everything and nothing. I did not wait for an answer, because I had already received it 1,000 times. The next morning, Elise called from an office where she manages numbers that no longer frighten her. "We're auditing the foundation," she said, laughter in the words. Voluntarily, "It's what you taught us. Truth even when nobody's asking." Before hanging up, she added, "I started a little program for kids who hate math. We call it Counting Promises." I leaned back and let the ceiling learn my grin. "Your father couldn't," I said gently. "You did. By then the watch had needed new springs." The jeweler, a patient man with thumbs like wisdom, showed me the old parts in a shallow tray. "They did their time," he said. "They can rest now." I brought the tray home and placed it inside the chest at Dock 17 with a note that read, "Retired pieces that kept the beat." If anyone ever opens that chest after I'm gone, I hope they understand. Even the parts that stop helped the time that didn't. One last letter found me in a season when the trees were elaborate and the afternoons brief. It was forwarded through the foundation with a note that said simply, "You'll want to read this alone." I did. It was from Helen. I sat on the pelican bench and a man 2 seats down said he liked my courage. I told him I didn't have any. He said, "You stayed alive." I don't know what I'm asking for except to say I know who I was, and I'm a little kinder to her now. I hope you are too. If you ever pass through, leave a coin on the bench. I'll know it was you. I folded the letter and did something my younger self would have considered melodramatic and my older self considered necessary. I put a coin in my pocket. Months later, the foundation sent me to speak at a small college on the Gulf. I walked the shoreline in the evening and found a bench where pelicans argued about weather reports they couldn't read. I did not look around. I took the coin from my pocket and set it on the slat beside me. A moment later, a hand I knew better by memory than touch moved the coin exactly 1 inch closer to me. "They're loud," Helen said, meaning the birds. "They're right," I said, meaning us. We did not make promises. We made room. When I stood to go, I left the coin and a sentence. Be happy enough to be kind. She nodded as if she had already begun. In the final accounting, the one I keep in the ledger that breathes, this is what the will made of me. A man who learned the difference between abundance and weight. A brother who learned that love doesn't erase fault, it carries it better. A son who finally returned the watch to the hour it was set to keep. If there is wealth left when I am gone, it will be divided the way my father once divided a box of nails. Some to build, some to mend, some to keep just in case a neighbor knocks. The chest at dock 17 will hold what paper can bear. The pier will hold what feet can bear. The people will hold the rest. On my 65th birthday, I woke before dawn without an alarm. I brewed coffee and did not forget to drink it. I wrote 2 checks, one small, one large, and mailed both without flourish. I walked the long way to the bus stop and let the morning argue itself into light. Strangers nodded like we belonged to the same uncomplicated club. At noon, Clark's grandson sent a photograph, a plaque newly mounted at the pier, the Langley Walk, and beneath it in smaller letters, for Robert who built and Harold who kept. I stared at it until tears blurred the type into river water. Then I wiped my eyes and read it again, properly like a man who has learned to pronounce his blessings. That evening I returned to Dock 17 with a small bag. Inside was Dad's watch, now set to the tide chart of Bay Harbor, a copy of Margaret's ledger, the little tray of retired springs, the photograph of the bakery, and the key with the red thread. I placed them in the chest with a letter of my own. If you are here because you loved someone who left, know this. The door is not locked from your side. Turn the handle. Let mercy in. Take what steadies you and leave what sinks you. Then go build a pier somewhere, anywhere out of good wood, and the people you trust to hold it. I closed the lid and did not take the key. The plaque on the inside shone dimly in the late light, like a truth that did not need convincing. I stepped outside to where the air could carry the words I am always surprised to find I still have. Good night, I said again, not to end anything but to keep the habit of being kind to endings. The water answered with its old affirmative, and the gulls argued wisely over scraps none of us needed. I walked to the end of the pier and stood until the line between sky and sea stopped pretending to be a line. When I finally turned back, the lights along the boardwalk blinked on in a sequence like a polite ovation. It felt like a curtain call. It felt like an opening night, and this is how I will be remembered if I am remembered at all, as the man who took a will and made it a verb, as someone who did not spend his brother's apology, but invested it in other people's mornings, as a keeper of time that wasn't his to start and wasn't his to stop, as a walker of docks, as a builder of yes, as a citizen of the mercy that keeps towns glued together when the wind is greedy. I'm simply Harold, I stayed. Then I went where I was needed, and when I'm finished, the watch will keep ticking without me, which is how you know you've set it right.